I am Laurie Pollpeter Eskenazi. I am a ceramic artist. I took my first ceramic class when I was a sophomore in high school, and once my hands hit the clay, I knew that that's exactly what I wanted to do. I graduated from high school, went to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and for a brief time, I questioned whether I wanted to change to fiber as my medium rather than clay. And I dabbled with that a little bit, and I just kept always going back to clay because I liked the fact that it's malleable and you can make anything you want with it. So I would always build things when I was in school. Even then, I was inspired very much by family history. I'm very into things that were in my grandmother's house, things that evoke memories of childhood, and the things that made me feel warm and cozy and comfortable. So those things were also in my sculptures when I was in college, but totally different. They didn't look anything like this stuff. And I, at the same time, was collecting a huge amount of vintage lace, quilts. I loved embroidery. I would love going through button boxes and looking at all of that stuff. And one day I thought, there's got to be a way that I can combine this passion for these things and clay. And so somehow, just through evolution, I came up with this way of working where I will form a piece. Sometimes it's totally hand-built. Sometimes I do the things just like start them on the wheel, and then from there it's just a way to get a shape or a form to start with. I'll alter them, and then I build on, and it's mostly coiled and hand-building. And I use vintage lace. I use pieces of embroidery. I've now started making handmade stamps, where I'll take a piece of clay and I'll carve into it, and it becomes a stamp that I can repeat the pattern over and over and over. And my whole thought process is always that I'm working on my pottery pieces as if a woman was building a crazy quilt from the Victorian era. So what they used to do then is take scraps of lace and do over embroidery and scraps of fabric, all different types of fabric, velvet, silk, everything. Didn't matter what it was. They would cut it up into little pieces, put it all together, over embroider in between things, and they'd have this magnificent quilt of all of this different stuff, and it didn't really matter what colors, what fabrics, it all kind of went together. So I used that thought process in my way of building a lot of things. So when I'm making my vases, for instance, I'll start building them, and I just grab pieces of lace, put them, the pattern into a small section of clay, attach it to my vase, keep adding things, and then once it's finished, I have all of these patterns and textures, and then I go back and I paint them with small paintbrushes in all different colors and all of that kind of stuff. And they just seem to always turn out. But the more gobbledygook I can get on it, the better it is for me. So in thinking about quilting, I started doing quilt blocks. So this is like an example of a quilt that I've done, and women used to do quilts that they called scrap quilts. So they would make one block, and the blocks didn't always match. So it's one block of several different fabrics or textures, and then they would sew all of those blocks together. Sometimes they would work in groups, like groups of women, and sisters would all make different blocks, and they would combine them to make a family quilt. So this is kind of my version of something like that, to make a quilt out of clay that would be on the wall. Then as far as like the vases that I work on that are like crazy quilts, or I have big bowls. So this is an example of a vase that I've done where I kind of am treating it like you would build a crazy quilt. So I started by throwing the base, but then I altered it by doing these little cutouts. I made it, more narrow. And then I start building, I put patterns and textures onto the bottom. I start building with coils, and I keep adding patterns. And here I added a piece here, but then I wanted some buttons. I do a lot of things that represent kind of buttons, to be like a button box. So there's buttons on here, and then I build, over that, and I just keep going around until I have it built up to the point that I think it looks like it's finished. And then after it's done, it's the painting and the different colors makes it feel like you have different chunks of fabric or pieces that would be parts of a quilt that are all melded together. And then of course sometimes I do these where these have a flower frog in the inside, so you can see that there's, to divide flowers. So the things that I make are functional, but can stand on their own too, just as an art piece, I guess. I also tend to do things because I'm very inspired by these things that women did, you know, the early part of the last century. People don't have time to do that anymore, but you know, where they would spend time making beautiful pieces of clothing and beautiful garments, and they would wear these garments. So I also make pieces that are kind of representational of like a bustier, like a woman would wear a bustier or their undergarments, and so I have vases that look like bustiers. So I build these things, these bustier forms, which there's two elements about them. One is it's showing, you know, when women used to wear all of the corsets and it's kind of constrictive and, you know, pulls in their waist, but there are also these things that are very ornate and they have lots of stitching and lots of different pattern and design on them. But I tend to like to put so that they have like pinwheels on the breast or things that make things very playful and they're very colorful. So there's a bit of, you know, this traditional kind of thing there, but then there's also this playful, fun aspect to the work that I do. I give them names. So like, for instance, this particular bustier, the name is, she thought she preferred strapless. So then I have other names that I've made for vases where it's, they'll have a big belt around the waist and it'll say, you know, she wondered if the belt was too much for the summer picnic, or the best part about the night was the kiss goodnight. So there are different names that I give them because as I'm building these pieces, whether it's a vase like this or a vase with attitude, because I also do these vases where it looks like women with their hands on their hips, I tend to give them, as I'm building them, because they take so long to build, they kind of start getting personalities, and I have stories in my head of what kind of women these would be or what they were doing, or, you know, so, and so that's kind of fun to play with that when I'm naming them. Another type of vase that I make is a cuff vase. So the idea behind that is, and it's a very functional vase that's great for displaying flowers, but it looks, I call them cuff vases because I throw the bottom and the top part looks like a fancy cuff, like a fancy sleeve on a woman's dress. So then they have little buttons and this fancy lace cuff, so that's why I call them cuff vases. And when I do things that are functional, like platters, I'll do a large functional platter, and to me that's a really great symbol of, you know, mothers and cooking and grandmothers and going to big feasts and being with family. So they get names like Her Gift or, you know, a family gathering or something like that, because to me that's all part of being a woman and the history of women and creating food for their, you know, for their families and the love that goes into that, as well as the love of, you know, like making beautiful garments for their kids and for themselves and all that kind of stuff. So it all kind of goes back to this whole thing of historically what women did for each other and for their families and all of that, I guess. So that's just kind of in a nutshell what my work's about. And everything that I make, all of the glazes and everything, because I want them to be functional pieces, the glazes are all food safe so people can use them. So not only are they, you know, a piece of art, they really do have a function, which I think is very important for me, that they can take pieces and use them every day in their home, because then it passes on more of that tradition of being in the home and being part of a family.